Alright folks, it's a little before 9 on a Saturday morning, and we're going to show you how easy it is to make a couple of quick loaves of yeasted bread. So we're starting at 9 o'clock, and to get started, the first thing we're doing is warming up the bowl. Fill the bread bowl with hot water. Alright, we've taken just a little bit of honey, a dab of honey, and put it into about 3/4 of a cup of warm water. The bowl was warm and the water was warm. Not too hot to stick your finger in, but make sure it feels warm. A little bit of honey to feed the yeast. Let's stir that around. Now we're doing what's known as proofing the yeast. Basically, we just dumped about a tablespoon of yeast in on this warm water with honey in it. Once I've opened my yeast, I just keep it frozen in the refrigerator. If you are careful with it, it'll last a year or so. It's a lot cheaper when you buy the big bag. Okay, you can see the yeast is getting kind of frothy, foamy around the edges and places. That's showing you that the yeast is alive and is starting to feed off of that little bit of honey and getting active, getting ready to go to work. So we're going to let that set for about 5 more minutes. Let that yeast proof for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Once you throw the yeast in, let it just get going, and you can see that we are making great progress. It's just 5 after 9 already, so we'll be into our bread making in another 5 minutes. Alright, now once the yeast is proofed real good and it's all bubbly and everything, we're going to add 1 cupful of a real good quality whole grain flour. We're going to dump that in, and it's going to be the texture of a mud. We're going to whip that around real good, getting a lot of oxygen into it, and we're going to let that set for about another 10-15 minutes. This is called a sponge. Now, good bread doesn't have to be complicated. Basically, we've really got enough ingredients at this point. We're adding about 1/8 of a cup of extra virgin olive oil, and take note that we're using canning and pickling salt, or also kosher salt will do. And basically, that's all you need to make bread, folks, is flour, water, yeast, a little bit of oil, a little bit of salt. Now, in our case, we're going to whip in a couple of eggs because we've got plenty of eggs, and they add a little bit of stability and kind of a nice texture to the bread, but you don't need them. You got enough at this point to make really fine bread. Now, as you can see, with the addition of the oil and a couple of eggs, we've gotten our sponge into a pretty sloppy mud type of mixture. Don't hesitate to take a couple extra minutes and whip as much oxygen in there as you can. This is your last chance to really get oxygen into your dough, that once you start adding flour and it becomes a whole lot more dense, then what you've got in there to feed that yeast is all it's going to get in there. So you want to whip as much oxygen into your batter as possible before you add more flour. A note on the flour. We're going to switch to white bread flour at this point. We're not total health food freaks. We like a nice quality product, particularly for making sandwiches and stuff. And we're going to give some of this bread away. So don't be afraid to use a little white flour. Do use at least maybe half whole wheat flour. That's my nutritional recommendation, but you do whatever the hell you want to do. Okay, we've been adding flour a little bit at a time, and as you can see, it's beginning to be kind of a sticky, gooey batter, beginning to roll over into a dough and get dried out. As you notice, we have no measuring cups. We don't measure the flour in Bob's Baking. We start out by measuring the liquids. The amount of bread we end up with depends on the amount of liquid that we start out with. The whole idea is it's a matter of feel and touch. Once you start adding the flour to your wet stuff, it's going to get drier and drier, spongier and spongier. You want to get it to a point where it feels right. There is no exact amount of flour. Different flours, different amounts. You want to start to feel your bread. You don't measure, you feel it. Alright, we've gotten our bread down to a point where it is not sticking to the side of the bowl. It's looking real good, feeling real good. But at this point, the idea is it feels pretty spongy still. See, my fingers will go into it, and it's got some texture and it's got some body, but it's still a little bit spongy to where we can push into it, so we can work in maybe another half handful of flour, a little bit at a time. At this point, you want to start working the flour in pretty slowly, and here is the secret to kneading. The idea is to fold it back into itself. If you always kind of mushroom it around and fold it back into itself, when you do that consistently in all the loaves you make, and even after you cut this in half, you can do that for your smaller loaves, because that's actually working with the natural rising action of the bread, so that when you're stretching your gluten and you're stretching your dough, you're stretching it out in a direction that it's going to rise naturally anyway, so you're sort of giving it a little bit of help. It's kind of like holding its hand along in its rising process before it's even really started rising. But it's kind of like raking in the garden. You got to remember, when you fold and knead bread, you're doing something that's creating some lines and channels that you can't see in that bread, but energy is going to travel along those, and if you're conscious of them, you can work with the energy to get a better rise out of your bread. Alright, we've kneaded the bread real good, and as you can see, it's used up all of the dry flour in the bowl, and the dough is dry enough in itself that it doesn't really stick badly to the bottom of the bowl as you pull it out. That's a real good indication that you're at just the right stage as to where it will pull without a bunch of dough sticking to the bowl. Okay, at this point, we're going to divide it into 2 loaves and let those rise for about an hour. In other words, we're just going to let it rise one good long time, maybe as long as an hour and a half or longer. This is one proof bread, that basically what we're looking to do is make some bread in a reasonable amount of time to where we can have something to give somebody that's stopping over today. And as you can see, so far we really have only invested about a half an hour of time. That it's 9:30, so if we work functionally and quickly, we can take the yeast and get it going, and we've only got about a half an hour into it. Alright, we've got 2 nice little mountain loaves of bread going. Only took us about 5 minutes to knead that bread out and draw it into those nice little balls, pretty nice and tight. Don't worry about little crevices and stuff on the bottom. That'll rise and fill in on its own, and it'll be alright. So now we're just going to let these set. This is the great part of bread making. You can now go and play the guitar for probably an hour or more. Alrighty, here we go. Alrighty, we've had about a half an hour so far to rise. We played a little guitar. We went down and collected the eggs. We got our usual 8 eggs this morning. Let's check the rise on the bread. Okay, a half hour, and we got some pretty good action going on. As you can see, we've got it set here on the back of the stove and had the oven turned on. so that it's creating some nice warmth in here. And you might also notice that there's a pan of water in the oven. The reason for that is that moist air in the oven makes crispier crust on your bread. And so there is one of the ways. And then of course, for a really crispy crust, you're going to actually baste the bread, maybe right at the end, with some milk to make it shiny. Alrighty, well, just go for another half hour, 45 minutes, and see how it looks. Alright, it's been about 55 minutes, and as you can see, our bread has risen to like maybe double in size, and it's looking really good. It's got some oomph left in it, so I don't think we have to worry about it falling or anything at this point. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the oven, and we're going to take the oven and turn it up to 425 degrees. 430 is good enough. I like a nice warm oven. Some people have different ideas about baking bread. I start out with a nice warm oven and then turn it down as the bread comes along. Your best bet is to experiment yourself, your oven, your methodology. Every oven is different. Altitude makes a difference. It's all a different situation every time, but you got to remember the bread is essentially a living thing at this point, and so you want to treat it with some respect and consideration to really keep it going in a nice fashion. Alright, it's been an hour. They're looking really pretty. They're just about touching, and as you can see, we've cut little slits into the top of one of them just to give it some cleavage. We'll check the difference as they bake. Okay, we're going to pop them into the preheated oven now. We've preheated it to 430 degrees. And what we have in here, if you remember, is we have a pan of water on the bottom shelf. So we have a really nice moist oven. And we're going to put them on the shelf right above it, which is right about the middle of the oven. It does get your bread off to a fast start, but you do risk brining it on top. So if you can see that, we've just covered it with a sheet of tin foil, and that'll keep the direct heat off of the top and allow it to get cooked nicely in the middle. Alright, basically the bread is done. So we're talking by the clock little more than 2 hours start to finish to make fresh, nice bread without any chemicals or artificial ingredients, and to your own enjoyment and to the enjoyment of your friends. 2 hours, and you're not even working those entire 2 hours. Part of that time you're playing the guitar and feeding the chickens. So it's really no big deal.